We were just discussing possible motives in the family. I suspect that Harlan has told you much unfiltered truth about each of them. And a little bird has told me, how shall I put this delicately? You have a regurgitative reaction to Miss Truden.
Who told you that?
Is it true?
Yes.
Oh.
It's something I've had since I was a kid. It's a physical thing that just the thought of lying, yeah, it makes me puke.
Really?
Is Richard having an affair?
Why do men instinctively pull at loose threads on their parachutes?
What? Richard?
Mm-hmm.
An affair?
Yeah. A yes or no will do.
No.
Oh, my dear girl, I'm sorry. I assumed you were speaking figuratively.
In a world overflowing with movies, we need a hero. Someone to separate the bad from the good.
Sounds like a job. Verbal dioramas. Watches all the movies from comedy to drama. From the top roll sound. And don't forget the action. She'll watch until the end and then she'll give you her reaction. Movies you know, movies you don't. Prequels, sequels, remakes, and trivia and outtakes. Movies you know, movies you don't. Interesting stories, all the categories.
Hi everyone, I'm Em and welcome to Verbal Diorama episode 258, Knives Out. This is the podcast that's all about the history and legacy of movies you know and movies you don't. And as always, hi, welcome to Verbal Diorama. Whether you are a regular returning listener, whether you are a brand new listener and you're just a huge fan of whodunits, thank you for being here. Thank you for choosing to listen to this podcast. There are plenty of movie podcasts out there, all vying for your ears. And I'm so happy that you're listening to this one. And I'm so happy to have you here for the history and legacy of Knives Out. This is a movie that I love very, very much, and it has been a long time coming to this podcast. Before I go into it, I just want to say, as always, thank you everyone who listens to this podcast. Thank you to everyone who continues to support this podcast. This podcast has been going now for over 5 years and over 250 episodes. Thank you for your support. It genuinely means the world to a solo indie podcaster that you are listening and supporting this podcast. And also for the lovely comments that I've had, especially for the most recent episode. All of the double episodes that I did in May for Remake, which were a task and a half to put together. So I don't think I'm probably going to be doing another month of double episodes anytime soon, because it was a hell of a lot of work to do. But the reaction was so lovely on the episodes that I did do. So just recently I did a double episode on Clash of the Titans, 1981 and 2010. A double episode of Dawn of the Dead, 1978 and 2004. A double episode of The Italian Job, 1969 and 2003. And most recently, a double episode on West Side Story, 1961 and 2021. And all of those episodes were incredible fun, but also incredibly hard. So if you did enjoy, if you did listen to those episodes, thank you so very much. And this episode really couldn't have been planned better. What with the recent announcements of the title of Knives Out 3, which is Wake Up Dead Man, and also the casting announcements that have come out too as well. Now, I plan episodes months in advance, but I guess that email to Rian Johnson didn't go unnoticed. Now, I can't lie. My poker face is non-existent, and you can ask any of my friends. I simply cannot do it. This is why I do not play poker or any other card game that involves keeping a straight face. However, unlike Marta, I don't have a regurgitative reaction to mistruthing. Here's the trailer for Knives Out.
I'm Detective Lieutenant Elliot, and
And this is Trooper Wagner. We just want to ask a few questions. We understand the night of his demise, the family have gathered to celebrate your father's 85th birthday. How was it, by the way?
The party? Pre my dad's death? Oh, it was great.
Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to request that you all stay until the investigation is completed.
What?
Can we ask why? Has something changed?
No.
No, it hasn't changed, or no, we can't ask.
I'm gonna live till I die.
You think one of his family
Walls.
killed? Is that what you're suggesting?
Let it cry. I'm gonna take the
You all love twisting the knife into one another.
up your ass.
Oh, very nice.
Matter of fact,
God.
how's that? Eat
Smug smile.
Definitely eat Gonna fly. I'll take a chance. Ride high. For my numbers up. I'm gonna fill my cup. I'm gonna live.
You know something. Spill it.
I suspect foul play. I have eliminated no suspects.
I'm gonna live.
It's a twisted web. We are not finished untangling it, not yet.
What is this? CSI KFC?
When renowned crime novelist Harlan Thrombey is found dead at his estate just after his 85th birthday, the inquisitive and debonair detective Benoit Blanc is mysteriously enlisted to investigate his apparent suicide. From Harlan's dysfunctional family to his devoted staff, Blanc sifts through a web of red herrings and self-serving lies to uncover the truth behind Harlan's untimely death. Let's run through the cast of this movie. What an incredible cast this movie has. Daniel Craig as Benoit Blanc, Chris Evans as Hugh Ransom Drysdale, Ana de Armas as Marta Cabrera, Jamie Lee Curtis as Linda Drysdale, Michael Shannon as Walt Thrombey, Don Johnson as Richard Drysdale, Toni Collette as Joni Thrombey, Lakeith Stanfield as Detective Lieutenant Elliot, Catherine Langford as Meg Thrombey, Jaden Martell as Jacob Thrombey, Frank Oz as Alan Stevens, Ricky Lindholm as Donna Thrombey, Edie Patterson as Fran, Kay Callan as Great Nana Wanetta Thrombey, Noah Segan as Trooper Wagner, and Christopher Plummer as Harlan Thrombey. Knives Out was written and directed by Rian Johnson. Now, I have famously steered away from huge franchises. I'm joking. This is why I don't do accents. I have famously steered away from huge franchises set in space with mega fandoms. Probably not for much longer, though. But one person who hasn't is Rian Johnson. Because after coming off making Star Wars Episode VIII: The Last Jedi, which grossed over $1.3 billion worldwide, he decided to throw himself into something completely different. A long gestating idea he'd had based on the Agatha Christie mysteries he loved as a child, and the puzzles he loved solving on set. Apparently, a crossword a day keeps the midichlorians at bay. Maybe. Johnson always wanted to emulate the great whodunit mysteries, the film adaptations of Agatha Christie's novels like 1974's Murder on the Orient Express, with Albert Finney as the only Hercule Poirot to receive an Academy Award nomination, 1978's Death on the Nile with Peter Ustinov's debut as Poirot, and 1982's Evil Under the Sun, starring Ustinov and Maggie Smith. Johnson has been very vocal about his love for these films, and of Christie's books in general, and after his directorial debut Brick in 2005, he conceived his own contemporary murder mystery whodunit. He put the idea on hold though, and instead worked on The Brothers Bloom in 2008, and his big breakthrough would be 2012's Looper, a great movie, I enjoy it very much, starring Joseph Gordon-Levitt, Bruce Willis and Emily Blunt. Also in 2012, Lucasfilm was sold to the Walt Disney Company, with Disney announcing a new trilogy of Star Wars films. By the time June 2014 came about, Johnson was in talks to direct Star Wars Episode VIII after J.J. Abrams' hugely successful The Force Awakens, and in August it was confirmed he was doing a Star Wars movie. In 2017, Star Wars Episode VIII The Last Jedi came out, and Johnson was also hired to helm a new trilogy of Star Wars movies. But mostly thanks to the divisive reactions to The Last Jedi, his Star Wars trilogy would be eventually cancelled in 2021. Obviously, none of this was known at the time, but when he found himself with a window of opportunity in between his galaxy far, far away commitments, he decided to make the mystery movie he'd built the basic concept of a decade prior. But that window would only be 1 year. And while I've talked on this podcast a few times about movies made in 1 year from start to finish, or sometimes less, it's incredibly hard to achieve, and it requires a tight schedule. That schedule came from his longtime producing partner, Ram Bergman, who mapped out a schedule in early 2018, which included Johnson actually writing the film, casting and shooting it before 2018 was out. But they also needed to secure financing, and there are conflicting reports as to how that was achieved. In 2018, Deadline reported that Media Rights Capital had acquired the rights in a bidding war at an auction held by CAA Media Finance and Film Nation with funding of $40 million. In 2020, Deadline reported it wasn't shopped around and that Johnson and Bergman had been talking with MRC for some time about a collaboration, securing the financing deal 6 weeks before the start of production. So, who knows the real story? All we know is that MRC did finance the film, and Lionsgate agreed to distribute and split production costs with MRC 50-50. Johnson started writing in January 2018 and wanted to do something very different to the whodunits of the past. He was going to tell the audience up front who the quote-unquote murderer was and lean into more Hitchcock-based storytelling. A rollercoaster ride, not a crossword puzzle, is how he describes it in an interview with Deadline. Once his script was finished, about 6 months later, characters were named, mostly after famous 70s musicians. Joni Mitchell, Richard and Linda Thompson, Neil Young, Neil is Joni's deceased husband, Steely Dan's Walter Becker and Donald Fagen, aka Donna Thrombey, but also Benoit after Johnson's French tutor, Ransom after the name of a character in C.S. Lewis's Space Trilogy, Harlan Thrombey was a nod to the Choose Your Own Adventure books, specifically Who Killed Harlow Thrombey, one of Johnson's favourite books as a child. I also loved Choose Your Own Adventure books as a child, and to be honest, I was the sort of child who would try and read every single eventuality of those stories, and even try and force different endings, because I'd read ahead, I'd find the ending that I liked the most, and then I'd try and force that ending by choosing certain paths in the book. You're not supposed to do it that way. But as a kid, I absolutely loved Choose Your Own Adventure books. Now, originally, this script wasn't particularly PG-13. It had quite a few swears in it. So he ended up amending the script to remove swears to make it PG-13. And the cast came together remarkably quickly too, with most of the Knives Out ensemble signed in October and November 2018, with Daniel Craig signed up first to play Benoit Blanc. And Rian Johnson loved his comedic role in Logan Lucky, but at the time Daniel Craig was committed to playing James Bond in No Time to Die. Then No Time to Die's filming got postponed for 3 months, leaving Craig available to read the script and accept the offer. And as the schedule was tight, it was all about filling the remaining roles with actors who were available, rather than picking and choosing actors they liked, although they did have a list of favourites. Not only did Daniel Craig sign on, but the deal with MRC included a lucrative back end for him as the lead. So he was already on board by the time the deal with MRC and Lionsgate came about. In order to mimic Blanc's voice, Craig spent 2 to 3 hours a day on speech training with a dialect coach. He studied writers Shelby Foote and playwright Tennessee Williams through C-SPAN interview video and the Ken Burns directed documentary The Civil War to perfect Benoit Blanc's southern drawl. The southern accent was Johnson's way of making Blanc a fish out of water against all the New England wasps. Usually, murder mysteries were set in period Britain. Rarely are they set in contemporary mainland USA. He took the name Knives Out from the song by Radiohead, saying it seemed like a great title for a murder mystery. Chris Evans was coming off finishing filming his Captain America swan song in Avengers Endgame and was preparing to take a hiatus from acting after 8 years in the MCU. Johnson saw Evans in the 2018 Broadway revival of Lobby Hero and saw him as the ideal ransom, with his selfless hero Captain America persona turned on its head. Evans was contacted and he wasn't going to do it, but when they told him they were filming in Boston and the surrounding areas near where the actor lived, he reconsidered. And according to some reports, after he read the script, he begged Johnson for the part. Ana de Armas filled Johnson's quota of wanting an actress for Marta who wasn't particularly well known. Casting director Mary Vernieu suggested her because she'd only started performing in English-speaking roles in 2014, and before that she'd only acted in Spanish-language roles. She'd come to the mainstream in a role in Denis Villeneuve's Blade Runner 2049, but that movie sadly underperformed, even though it's brilliant. And we'll come to this podcast soon because I love Blade Runner 2049. De Armas wanted to steer clear of the typical Latina roles of the housekeepers and the quote-unquote help, but she was drawn to Marta despite passing on the role originally, and read the completed script and realised that Marta's immigrant backstory was fundamental to her character arc, and that fundamentally she was a good, kind person, but also resilient and brave. She was the Hitchcock protagonist, the outsider who would garner audience empathy and elevate the film's stakes. Johnson would comment on De Armas's Audrey Hepburn type thing with her expressive eyes, and the running joke in the movie about the family seeing her as one of the family, but not having a clue where she actually comes from, is something De Armas championed and also still gets in real life. She's Cuban, just FYI. And the ensemble just seemingly gets bigger, with the likes of Jamie Lee Curtis, Don Johnson, Michael Shannon, Lakeith Stanfield and Toni Collette signing on, not to mention Christopher Plummer, who would sadly pass away himself 2 years after the release of this movie. Plummer loved the Knives Out script immediately and would say upon its release that the movie was a little masterpiece. He relished the healthy competition of starring alongside the ensemble cast. Toni Collette, who like Jamie Lee Curtis and Michael Shannon, filmed faux ads for their in-universe accomplishments, in no way channeled her previous co-star of Emma and the pallbearer Gwyneth Paltrow. Joni and her over-the-top wellness empire Flam is not a parody of Paltrow or Goop, but of Instagram influencers in general, just your typical Californian lifestyle guru. Jamie Lee Curtis would read the script and feel a connection to Linda Drysdale due to her own famous parents. She would say, quote, "As the daughter of famous people, I have fought for my own right to exist in the world, and I think when you have a famous father, as I do in this movie, no matter what, the children will always feel diminished," unquote. She would end up feeling quite isolated during filming and played the matriarch role by spending time in the kitchen with the actual family who owned the house. While Johnson was writing the script, Bergman was assembling the crew, many of whom actually came back from working with Johnson on The Last Jedi. And just like cult classic Clue, to which this movie owes a debt of gratitude, the majority of the filming takes place under one roof. The Thrombey Mansion actually comprises 2 separate buildings. The filmmakers are contractually prohibited from disclosing the private one, which was mostly used for exterior shots. The other is the Ames Mansion, a stately stone mansion constructed as a home in the early 1900s that serves as the focal point of eastern Massachusetts Borderland State Park, and this was mostly used for the interior shots. The Ames Mansion was part of the 1,200-acre estate of Blanche Ames Ames, an incredible woman, an inventor, a designer and an architect. Ames and her husband Oakes Ames married in 1900. They actually had the same surname, but they were not related to each other. So upon marriage, Blanche Ames became Blanche Ames Ames, which I just actually love. They built the stone mansion in 1910, the design and engineering requirements of which Blanche Ames Ames managed herself after she was dissatisfied with the architect they'd originally hired. Oakes Ames was a Harvard lecturer on botany and a renowned authority on orchids and came from a wealthy Massachusetts family. Blanche Ames was involved in art, farming, engineering and politics. She illustrated her husband's botanical books. She was active in politics from 1915 to 1918. She served as treasurer of the League of Women Voters and co-founded the Birth Control League of Massachusetts. She became well known for her political cartoons that portrayed the right for women's suffrage, And along with her various other achievements, Blanche was also an inventor, having created a hexagonal timber cutter in 1939. She and her brother Adelbert Ames developed the Ames colour system. She invented, tested and received a patent for a technique used in World War II to entangle enemy aircraft in wires suspended from balloons. A year before she passed away in 1969, Blanche Ames, who had been active her entire life, was granted a patent for a water anti-pollution device. The Ames estate is open to the public as Borderland State Park, and the park itself is a popular filming location. Martin Scorsese filmed Shutter Island next to the Leech Pond. Ghostbusters 2016 was also filmed inside the Ames mansion, and when scouting for locations, Knives Out's location manager Charlie Harrington and production designer David Crank knew right away it was the place right out of one of Harlan Thrombey's murder mystery novels. The same family still own the house, but it is almost a time capsule, lovingly preserved and hardly altered in 100 years. The Knives Out team would use the first floor of the house and the exterior, and they built the second floor and third floor on a soundstage because there were issues with the size of the hallways and rooms on the upper floors. They based the new floors on the existing architecture of the house and found random things to add to rooms, like the giant doll's house found by set decorator David Schlesinger that became incorporated into the bar. The house was a character in its own right, and there had to be things within it that were personal to Harlan Thrombey himself, including giant works of art where his expression changes, and of course the novels that built his fame and fortune. One of Rian Johnson's favourite films is the 1972 version of Sleuth, with Laurence Olivier and Michael Caine. That movie is also centred on a mystery writer and largely takes place inside the mansion, but the interiors of the mansion reflect his brain. So Johnson gave David Crank, the production designer, and David Schlesinger, the set designer, that reference, and they just ran with it. They scoured Massachusetts for oddities, trinkets, automatons and artwork. There's even crime dioramas in the background too, in homage to Francis Glessner Lee's dioramas of the 1940s. And I think that's the first time I've ever mentioned dioramas on Verbal Diorama. Basically, the more delicate, expensive and rare, the better. Basically, all of the things you would never want on a film set. The Guinness collection in Morristown, New Jersey, had one of the best collections of automatons in the world, but they wouldn't allow their pieces to leave the museum. So they put David Schlesinger in touch with a restorer who was willing to lend some of their own automaton collection. None of this was cheap. Crafting, technicians, transportation and rental fees all had to be considered. Even the knives for the famous Wheel of Knives were rented, mostly from George and Judy Jagg, who also lent the production 2 German Shepherd bronze sculptures. The Wheel of Knives was supposed to be in display over the library mantelpiece. Rian Johnson and director of photography Steve Yedlin, who I'm going to be coming to, they blocked the scenes thinking that the knives would create a backdrop or a halo behind several actors being questioned. They wanted something that would allow light to pass through while remaining solid, aiming to create a feeling of motion in the knives as though they were being thrown towards the centre. Several prototypes were created, but nothing was working, so they ended up building an armature and hanging it off a chain from the balcony, and it became the focal point for the movie, always in the background, but only being centre stage when Benoit Blanc finally fills the middle of the donut. Art director Jeremy Woodward's task was figuring out the entire canon, at least 4 decades worth, of Harlan Thrombey's work from decade to decade. He designed how each of the book jackets looked and how they changed from decade to decade. And the production made up mystery novel names like Drop in the Bucket, Around the Corner and Down the Lane, Vulcan's Den, The Needle Game, This Little Piggy, Nick of Time, The Wrong Tree, Keeper, Ultimatum, and Hook, Line and Sinker, which is a real book, published as a posthumous publication / companion piece for the release of the film. The blurb on Goodreads states, quote, "In Hook, Line and Sinker, best-selling novelist Harlan Thrombey is at his cutthroat best. Retired actor Truman Flynn has been found dead on the shore of a lake with no sign of his fishing boat, but there is a long trail of blood and an even longer trail of suspects. Truman's wealthy business partners, his caregiver and a mysterious visitor all have a motive to shatter the calm of this remote lake town. Now a weather-beaten police chief and his trusted deputy must sift through the clues to find the killer," unquote. If only they'd made a Knives Out sequel called Hook, Line and Sinker, am I right? Director of photography Steve Yedlin has worked with Rian Johnson on 4 previous movies, including The Last Jedi. And back in 2015, he filmed his own example to prove that digital filmmaking can look as good as shooting on traditional film, that the look of film can be replicated in the digital pipeline. His own field research was used for the specialised colour grading process on Knives Out, and they followed Robert Altman's cinematic style, using camera movements to build action like dolly zooms and whip pans. Ultimately, the aim was to make the movie with modern digital filmmaking techniques, but make it look like it was filmed on traditional 35mm film with a 2-camera shoot. Filming started on the 30th of October 2018, taking full advantage of the New England autumn, or fall, should I say. Filming took place over 38 days, ending on the 20th of December 2018, which fulfilled the exact schedule of starting to write this movie at the start of 2018 and finishing filming by the end of the year. Filming took place across Massachusetts, in Maynard, Boston, Lincoln, Canton, Wellesley, Waltham, Medfield and Marlborough. And there really is no easy segue into this, so I'm just going to segue into it really awkwardly. The obligatory Keanu reference has returned to this podcast. I know it's been a bit sketchy over the last few episodes, mostly because it's kind of hard to do, especially with double episodes. However, the obligatory Keanu reference is a part of the podcast where I try and link the movie that I'm featuring with Keanu Reeves. And you probably already guessed, because I've kind of mentioned it already, that Ana de Armas, her first Hollywood movie, was in 2014. That movie was called Knock Knock. And that movie also co-starred Keanu Reeves. So really, Ana de Armas's Hollywood career is kind of thanks to Keanu Reeves. Now, Knock Knock, it's not a brilliant movie. I have watched it actually quite recently, but Keanu does like to do different movies, and this is definitely something very different in his movie history. But if you are interested in the work of Ana de Armas and her first Hollywood role, it's definitely worth a watch just for that. Now, Rian Johnson loves to work with the same people over and over again. I've not mentioned it, but Joseph Gordon-Levitt does have a cameo in this movie. He is the detective on the TV show that Marta's sister is watching. So Rian Johnson loves to work with Joseph Gordon-Levitt. His cousin Nathan Johnson is also another regular collaborator, and he first worked with Rian Johnson on the movie Brick. Nathan Johnson is also a music video director and worked with Guillermo del Toro most recently on Nightmare Alley. He recorded the score for Knives Out with an orchestra at London's Abbey Road Studios, the first time he'd ever worked with a full orchestra. He also often visited the set for melodic cues and motifs, as well as taking inspiration for the score of the movie from Death on the Nile and Lawrence of Arabia. Now, if we go back in time to the heady days of 2019, I definitely remember watching the trailers for Knives Out and just being immediately enthralled with the idea of this big budget, huge ensemble cast, Rian Johnson directed whodunit. And the trailers for Knives Out, looking back retrospectively, were surprisingly tame, especially with the recent trend to mention every joke or spoil certain key scenes. Knives Out needed to tread the fine line of see our movie without here's a load of key plot details. I think the trailers for this movie do that incredibly well. Knives Out was one of very few high-profile releases that seemed to buck the trend of only franchises getting significant pre-release buzz. The social media and marketing strategies included a gamified transmedia experience called Get Your Cut, featuring Frank Oz as Harlan Thrombey's personal attorney, for an interactive campaign where participants could solve mysteries hidden within the marketing to win a share of Thrombey's fortune. 2019 was a huge year for big budget franchises, remakes and sequels. Let's go through the list. So Avengers Endgame topped the global box office. That was followed by the, quote, live-action remake of The Lion King, the sequel Frozen 2, the sequel Spider-Man Far From Home, the comic book adaptation Captain Marvel, the sort of comic book adaptation Joker, the sequel Star Wars Episode IX, The Rise of Skywalker, the sequel Toy Story 4, and the quote-unquote live-action adaptation of Aladdin. And they all exceeded $1 billion at the box office globally in 2019. That was what 2019 was all about. All of those movies made over $1 billion. Knives Out would be the 29th biggest release of the year. But when most of the preceding 28 films were sequels, adaptations of existing material, or franchises, Knives Out is actually a remarkable success story. It premiered at the 44th Toronto International Film Festival on the 7th of September 2019, and on its general release on the 27th of November 2019, the same week as Frozen 2, might I add, it had to settle for 4th place at the box office behind Frozen 2, Ford v Ferrari, and A Beautiful Day in the Neighbourhood. Its second week, though, its box office jumped up 136%, and its box office placing went up to 2nd behind Frozen 2. While it would never hit number 1 thanks to Frozen 2 and then The Rise of Skywalker, Knives Out would continue to perform well over the Christmas period and stay in the top 10 for 10 weeks. On its $40 million budget, Knives Out grossed $165.4 million domestically in the US and $147.5 million internationally, for a total worldwide gross of $312.9 million. The fact that Knives Out did as well as it did in such a crowded year is exceptional. This is a movie that is completely new, completely different from everything else, and I think we forget just how busy 2019 actually was at the cinema. And obviously, critics absolutely adored this movie too. It was considered one of the year's best films by the American Film Institute. The mainstream press ranked it highly in their lists, and on Rotten Tomatoes, it holds a rating of 97%. And the consensus reads, Knives Out sharpens old murder mystery tropes with a keenly assembled suspense outing that makes brilliant use of writer-director Rian Johnson's stellar ensemble. So this movie not only did incredibly well financially, but also received universal critical acclaim. It was also nominated for the Academy Award for Best Original Screenplay, but lost to Bong Joon-ho and Han Jin-won's terrific Parasite, which also should come to this podcast at some point because it's an incredible movie. Parasite received the most wins that night, and rightly so. Knives Out also received a Best Original Screenplay nomination from the BAFTAs, as well as 3 Golden Globe nominations for Best Motion Picture Musical or Comedy, Best Actor Musical or Comedy for Daniel Craig, and Best Actress Musical or Comedy for Ana de Armas. The COVID-19 pandemic affected a lot of cinematic releases in 2020 and 2021, and while Lionsgate were chomping at the bit to make a sequel, Johnson and Bergman owned the intellectual property and decided to pursue a different avenue for distribution in the wake of the pandemic. Glass Onion, a Knives Out mystery, was the first in a deal with Netflix, a 2-sequel agreement worth $469 million, and only Daniel Craig reprises his role as Benoit Blanc. New cast members included Janelle Monáe, Edward Norton, Catherine Hahn, Leslie Odom Jr., Kate Hudson, and Dave Bautista. Glass Onion, this time named after a Beatles song, had a brief week's release window in cinemas in November 2022 before Netflix pulled it, only to release it again as a Netflix exclusive in December 2022. The third movie, Wake Up Dead Man, this time named after a U2 song, is currently announcing a stellar cast on social media as of recording this episode. So far announced, Daniel Craig returning as Benoit Blanc, obviously, with Josh O'Connor, Kaylee Spaney, Andrew Scott, Kerry Washington, Glenn Close, Jeremy Renner, and Mila Kunis co-starring. And as much as I enjoyed Glass Onion, to me, Knives Out is just such a superior movie. I will probably enjoy Wake Up Dead Man as well, but as I'm going to come to, I feel like we are really missing these movies at the cinema. One of the main things that I take away from Knives Out is that you can still love someone and see that they're a bad person. And you can still love someone and deny them. You can still love someone and say no. You can also cut out toxic people from your life. Rian Johnson has always clarified that the main narrative of Knives Out aims to evoke thought rather than to condemn or support any particular ideology. He believed that whodunit stories were an excellent way to examine institutional power, a perspective shaped by Agatha Christie's writings, which he considered to be indicative of a non-political woman who was attuned to British societal leanings. Knives Out is whatever you take it to be, but it does have clear underlying themes of class warfare, immigration, race and wealth inequality, as well as exploring white privilege and white saviour tropes. Knives Out's plot revolves around the mysteries surrounding Harlan Thrombey's death, but as the narrative develops, it becomes clear that this movie is really about something else. The myth of perseverance and hard work is prevalent throughout Knives Out. Their father's publishing empire is something that all his family mention they're proud of him for building through sheer hard work and determination. Linda Drysdale, the daughter of Harlan, is sure to tell Benoit Blanc that she too started her own company from the ground up. Naturally, though, those tales don't tell the whole story, because no one's tales tell the whole story. Because without the large loan that her father gave her, Linda would not be where she is today. Walt is the acting head of his father's publishing company, but never carved out a career of his own. The backstabbing in the family starts early, with each of them bad-mouthing each other to the detectives. The initial grief of the family dissolves to show the many red flags surrounding Harlan's death. Nearly everyone in the family is revealed to have motive, despite us seemingly knowing from the start what happened. While Benoit Blanc works his way through the family's little white lies, the Thrombeys are solely focused on inheriting Harlan's generous legacy. The Thrombeys are cutthroat, obnoxiously rich people feigning remorse, as well as feigning caring for Marta. Marta herself is not in the country illegally, but her mother is undocumented. There's a common misconception between illegal and legal immigrants, because to some, an illegal immigrant equates to having malicious intent, while a legal immigrant equates to being morally correct and deserving of opportunity. But this is actually quite a toxic generalisation, because in truth, almost all immigrants cross borders with the intention of working hard and improving their life. Immigrants are just as hardworking and driven as legal citizens, if not more so. But the media feeds us this narrative of illegal equals bad person, legal equals good person. To the Thrombeys, Marta is a good immigrant, until they realise Harlan has left her everything in his will, and then she's a bad immigrant. Privilege is the villain in this story, what it does to the people born into it, and how horrific being privileged can be in the way it strips you of your decency and makes you ugly, even to the people you love. I don't think one family member speaks a word of kindness to Great Nana Wanetta, even though her son has just passed away. The only person we actually see doing so is Benoit Blanc. These people aren't inherently villains, but the toxicity of the world they were brought up in and exposed to nurtures their own internal superiority. It speaks to the tired old cliches of course Marta couldn't just have been the only decent person in Harlan's life. Of course a young pretty nurse has more to the story. But no, Marta's kindness and empathy was always her superpower, and even an attempt by Ransom to frame her for his death backfired, because she's not just an immigrant, or a Latina, or a caregiver to an elderly man, she's a damn good nurse. It's the attention to detail that blows me away with this movie. From the cinematography's almost grainy quality on purpose, to the way the production uses light to emphasise or hide things. The portrait of Harlan changing expressions from a grimace to a smirk when Marta takes the inheritance, to every clock and phone being set to the correct time in the film so you can keep track of the events. This movie rewards multiple rewatches and leaves nothing to waste. Everything has a purpose. This movie was made for just $40 million with this huge cast, this amazing production and set design. Rian Johnson is often lauded for being a filmmaker for film fans, and to be honest, I see this even in The Last Jedi. The similarities are clear to me. Kylo Ren, as a mouthpiece of toxic masculinity, blends so seamlessly into the Thrombey family's depictions of white privilege, white supremacy, nepotism, and anti-immigration. Knives Out isn't just a good movie, it's a great example of high-quality filmmaking without the need for an $100+ million budget. Mid-budget movies are on the decline, but with the big-budget movies failing to attract audiences, seriously, The Fall Guy is great, didn't deserve to fall. I've not seen Furiosa yet, but probably same. We need more of these thoughtful, fun, different, mid-budget movies. They just need to be this well thought out, well written and compelling. And they also need to be coming to cinemas and not just confined to streaming. I know you had a very lucrative deal with Netflix, Rian Johnson, but we need more movies like this in cinemas, please. We also need more movies where kindness and empathy are seen as superpowers, and we definitely need more actors willing to take on silly accents. Thank you for listening. As always, I would love to hear your thoughts on Knives Out. And thank you for your continued support of this podcast. If you have enjoyed this podcast and you want to help it grow, get involved and leave a rating or review wherever you found this podcast. You can follow me at Verbal Diorama on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky, and Letterboxd. Or simply just tell your friends and family about this podcast and spread the word however you can. Please take a moment to tell someone about this podcast if you enjoy it and if you got value out of it. If you like this episode on Knives Out, I haven't actually really done any other whodunits or murder mysteries or anything like that. So really, the only movies I could think of were episode 62, Scooby-Doo, because Scooby-Doo is essentially a mystery. And I loved going into the history and legacy of Scooby-Doo. It was one of those very few episodes that I managed to get a little cameo from my cat Jess. Long-time listeners will know all about Jess. She is the noise that you hear at the end of every episode. She was a very vocal cat. She passed away in early 2022, but she regularly popped up on episodes and she really got very vocal about Scooby-Doo. Maybe she was like a murder mystery fan. I don't remember if she ever watched Knives Out with me, but maybe she did. And the only other episode that I could think of, just because it has a little homage to Scooby-Doo in it, is 199 Wayne's World. Otherwise, there is no comparison between Wayne's World and Knives Out, because Wayne's World is a totally different movie. But there is a very fun section in Wayne's World where they find out who did it, which is always fun. Maybe don't give me feedback on these episode recommendations because they're not the greatest, but maybe I should just cover more whodunits. Maybe I should do Clue on this podcast. That's a fun movie. I'll pop that on the list. Now, I did give a bit of a hint at the start of this episode about me famously steering away from huge franchises set in space with mega fandoms. And you might be thinking, oh my God, is Em finally going to be doing a Star Wars movie? I have actually done a Star Wars movie. I did Rogue One a long time ago because I love Rogue One. However, I'm sorry to disappoint because I'm not going to be doing any Star Wars. I am staying far, far away from that for the time being. But I did want to go into space and I did want to do something for the legions of fans who love this franchise and all its reboots, spin-offs, reincarnations. A convention-busting franchise in more ways than one, and its first cinematic outing in 1979, which led to Next Generations, Deep Space, Final Frontiers, Voyages, Discoveries, and Strange New Worlds, among other things. It has a huge history and legacy. But I'm going to go where no man or woman has gone before, apart from everyone else who's ever talked about it on a podcast, because the next episode is on the history and legacy of Star Trek the Motion Picture from 1979, and I know a lot of people will be looking forward to this, and I really hope I do it justice. So please join me next week for the history and legacy of Star Trek the Motion Picture. Just by listening to this podcast, you are supporting this podcast. However, if anything that I do feels like it's valuable to you and you feel like you could spare $1 here and there, you can support the show financially, and you can do that one of two ways. You could give a one-off tip at verbaldiorama.com/tips, or you can support the show on Patreon at verbaldiorama.com/Patreon, and you can join the amazing, incredible patrons of this podcast. They are Simon E, Sade, Claudia, Simon B, Laurel, Derek, Kat, Andy, Mike, Luke, Michael, Scott, Brendan, Lisa, Sam, Jack, Dave, Stuart, Nicholas, Zoe, Kev, Pete, Heather, Danny, Ali, Stu, Brett, Philip, Michelle, Zenos, Sean, Rhino, and Russell. If you do want to get in touch with me, you want to say hi, you want to give me some feedback, or you want to make a suggestion, you can. You can email verbaldiorama@gmail.com. Or you can go to my website, verbaldiorama.com. You can see every single episode that's ever been released. And you can also fill out the contact me form as well. You can also find my stuff at filmstories.co.uk. I write a column in the magazine, which comes out every month. And I also write weekly articles on the website as well. And finally...
Yes? Doctor, that's great news. We'll be there soon. Thank you. She's okay. She's ready to talk.
Trooper Wagner, if you could keep Mr. Drysdale in custody while Lieutenant Elliott, Miss Cabrera, and myself, we go to the hospital and take Fran's statement.
All right, up, come on.
I'm going to say this just to you. No cameras, no courtroom, just you, because you know it's true. We allowed you into our home. We let you watch our granddad. We welcomed you into our family. And now you think you can steal it from us? You think I'm not going to fight to protect my home? Our birthright? Our ancestral family home?
That is hooey. You know, Harlan, he bought this place in the 80s from a Pakistani real estate billionaire.
Shut up, Blanc. Shut up! Shut up with that Kentucky Fried Foghorn Leghorn drawl. Yeah, I killed Fran, but I guess I didn't. So what do you have on me? Nothing. What, attempted murder? I get arson for the building and a few other charges. With a good lawyer, which I have, I'll be out in no time. And then you'll see just how much hell I can wreak on your life, you vicious little... Oh, Lord. What the Oh, that means she's lying.
Yeah, man, we know.
That's right. Fran's dead. And you just confessed to her murder.
Well, in for a penny.
Bye.
Movies you know.